The prevailing economic ideology prior to the 20th century was liberalism, and liberalism ended with the Great Depression. So it's an incredibly important event not only for US macroeconomic history, but also for the spread of ideas and how people have thought about the role of economics and the role of economists. The Great Depression was the knockout blow for economic liberalism and paved the way for an increasing role in the size and scope of the state. If we look at US GDP from 1920 to 1940, we can see the dramatic fall in billions of constant dollars from 1999, which demonstrates this period of the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933. And this really was seen as being something that up until that point had no real explanation and simply wasn't supposed to happen. Now, when I started learning economics, I thought I understood the basic idea behind what caused the Great Depression. But the more I've learned in economics, the more I've realized that that kind of basic view has some deep flaws. So I'm going to present this as some myths and some facts. I think the first myth about the Great Depression is that speculation and greedy bankers on Wall Street caused a bubble. In other words, the Wall Street boom that preceded the Great Depression was caused by speculation and greed and all of the thrills of the stock exchange, when in actual fact I think a better explanation is that loose monetary policy by the newly created Federal Reserve caused an asset price bubble. It's not so much the behaviour of bankers that caused the bubble, but it was more to do with what the monetary policy actions of the Federal Reserve was. Second myth of the Great Depression is that it was the stock market crash itself that caused the depression. And whilst it's true that the stock market crash, the Wall Street crash of 1929, preceded the Great Depression, the stock market actually rebounded quite quickly. And during the Great Depression, there was periods where the stock market did quite well. So it's simply not the case that there's a strong link between what was happening in the stock market and what was happening in the wider economy. The third myth is that the New Deal and World War II, i.e. large increases in government spending, ended the Depression. And I think in actual fact, government policy turned a downturn into a depression, and the Great Depression was ended not through fiscal policy, but ultimately through monetary policy, as we'll see. This chart just shows the Wall Street crash on the Dow Jones Industrial Average during 1929-1930, and we can see the period that's typically referred to as the Wall Street crash. But as this Economist article points out, two of the very best years in American stock market history were in 1933 and 1935, which were right in the middle of the Depression itself. So we did see the stock market rebound. We did see some early signs of recovery. It's not the case that a falling stock market led to the Great Depression. If we want to understand more about what caused the Great Depression, I think it's better to look at money supply data. So this is taken from Greg Mankiw's textbook, and it's based on the very famous study by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz in their A Monetary History of the United States. What we can see here is that at the time many people were focusing on the central bank's activity in terms of what they were doing with the monetary base, the very narrow measure of a money supply, and the part of the money supply that the Federal Reserve, the central bank, directly controls. And as we can see from August 1929 to March 1933, the monetary base increased, and it looked at the time as though the Federal Reserve was doing a lot. However, if we look at a broader measure of the money supply, we can see that from August 29, money supply actually shrank from 26.5 to 19. What this implies is that there was a fall in the money multiplier, and we can see this in more detail with the chart. We can see from August 1929 to March 1933, although there was an increase in the amount of currency in the US economy, demand deposits, broader measure of the money supply, actually contracted. So I think the Fed needs to take the blame for causing the Great Depression rather than Wall Street. Not only did the Fed cause the boom in the first place with low interest rates, but the reason why the boom turned to bust was because the Fed compounded the mistake of creating excessively easy monetary policy in the build-up in the 1920s to creating excessively tight monetary policy in the 1930s. The Fed doubled reserve requirements in early 1937. By the end of the year, the economy was sliding into a deep slump. Scott Sumner has pointed out that the minutes of the November 1937 meeting revealed that one of the governors didn't want to cut reserve requirements because reversing their earlier decision would be embarrassing. It's quite clear that at the time, Fed officials were asleep at the wheel and were allowing the economy to contract due to their inability to allow the money supply to increase as it should have done. Now, it wasn't only monetary mistakes. We can say that monetary mistakes were then compounded by additional fiscal folly. So tax rates increased, which dented incentives. Tariffs increased, which amplified falling global trade at the time. As we can see, from 1925 to 1945, the top rate of marginal income tax increased steadily in the United States. Prior to the Great Depression, top rate of income tax was around 25%, and yet by 1945 it had reached 94%. That increase in taxes was reducing incentives and generating a reduction in economic growth. You can also see the impact of increased tariffs. From 1929 to 1933, world trade plummeted, which had a massively negative impact on the US economy. Partly this was because of what was happening in the US economy, partly it was as a result of increases in tariffs which slowed down global trade. So what didn't end the Great Depression? Well, I don't think the New Deal ended the Great Depression. New Deal labour and industrial policies did not lift the economy out of the Depression as President Roosevelt had hoped. It was the subsequent abandonment of these policies that coincided with the strong economic recovery of the 1940s. What also didn't end the Great Depression was the Second World War. From 1942 to 1946, some macroeconomic performance measures were statistically inaccurate, others were conceptually inappropriate. A better grounded interpretation is that during the war the economy was a huge arsenal in which the well-being of consumers deteriorated. After the war, genuine prosperity returned for the first time since 1929. Wartime spending does capture all sorts of government spending and spending that takes place in the real economy. But stockpiling weapons doesn't do anything to generate prosperity or increases in living standards. As we see here, the war itself did not get the economy out of the Depression. The economy produced neither a carnival of consumption nor an investment boom. However successfully, it overwhelmed the nation's enemies with bombs, shells, and bullets. There were certain events of the war years, though, the build-up of financial wealth, especially the transformation of expectations, that justify an interpretation that views the war as an event that recreated the possibility of genuine economic recovery. But it was only as the war actually ended that real prosperity returned. And these expectations play a very important part. Robert Higgs has argued that FDR's policies, Roosevelt's policies such as the New Deal, didn't have the impact that they advocates claimed, partly because of the impact on incentives and also expectations. Higgs says FDR's policies prevented a robust recovery of long-term private investment by significantly reducing investors' confidence in the durability of private property rights. We've seen how dramatic increases in marginal income tax rates undermined private property rights. That was one of a number of policies at the time that meant that people living in the United States became genuinely concerned whether or not the state would overreach and what was happening to the underlying regime of private property rights. Higgs has labelled this concept the concept of regime uncertainty. He argued that changing the rules of the game creates regime uncertainty, and entrepreneurs hold off on investment because they aren't sure what interventions will occur. So the massive increase in fiscal stimulus and the massive expansion of the state during FDR's tenure backfired because it meant that people were concerned about where these interventions may lead. And normally, the business environment requires stability and the ability to plan and the ability to invest. And when there's large-scale policy changes taking place and large increases in the size and scope of the state, this can backfire by causing investors to hold off investment out of concern as to see what will happen and where the economy is headed. So what did end the Great Depression, if not fiscal policy? I think the general explanation, and Christina Romer's September 1991 article, What Ended the Great Depression, is probably the definitive view. She argues that the recovery was due to monetary expansion, not fiscal stimulus. Gold inflows increased the money supply, lowered real interest rates, and thus stimulated investment spending. She argues that self-correction played little role in the growth of real output from 1933 to 1942. But we can see, if we look at what happened to inflation, which is the blue line, and we can also see what happens to the M2 measure of the money supply, the green line, and we can see the Wall Street crash happened in 1929. After the Wall Street crash in 1929, we saw the Great Depression was caused by the reduction in the money supply, and then the recovery ultimately happened through monetary expansion. The final point to make about the Great Depression is that the first slide I showed demonstrated the dramatic fall in real GDP during the period of the Great Depression, but this chart is showing a longer time horizon. What we can see now is that although the Great Depression shows a dramatic deviation from the underlying trend line, ultimately what matters for economic growth is the green underlying trend line. Even the Great Depression is a fluctuation around that trend line, and whilst news reports tend to focus on those short-term fluctuations, ultimately over time it's the trend growth rate that matters more than those short-term fluctuations. Now, those myths and facts that I mentioned, I think they did become something that most people latched onto. The idea that it was the stock market crash that caused the Great Depression and increases in fiscal policy that got America out of the Great Depression have lasted a long time. And ultimately, the impact of the Great Depression on a generation of intellectuals was to see that free markets failed and that government was the ultimate solution. As Lord Skidelsky said, if the First World War left economic liberalism reeling, then the Great Depression of the 1930s was virtually a knockout blow.